我哋而家嚟到呢一場就係我哋請到 Stephan 啦，咁佢而家就喺CTU 度教緊一啲 politics 嘅科目嘅，咁我哋而家就可能會講對比下新加坡同埋香港嘅一個民主運動嘅，咁全部都係會以英文授課嘅，咁如果有人需要 translate 嘅話，都可以落嚟我哋講台側邊，咁我哋就嘗試 translate 下俾你聽都 OK。我哋俾掌聲 Stephan 好嘛 ？Stephan please。
Okay, thank you very much for coming, and I must of course first apologize, that my lecture is in English, and I cannot speak in Cantonese here. So number one, apology, and number two, I'm not as able to speak freely as the previous one, I have to look at my slides, They are online, so you should be able to get them on your screen too, So what I want to do here is bring a little bit of comparative perspective into the whole thing, and look at another very similar country or a similar place is Singapore, and that's why my talk is called Democracy Movement in Hong Kong and Singapore. So I have three parts. First, why compare at all? Why do we look to Singapore or another place to even do that? Then some important similarities and differences to help us explain it. And finally, to explain the strength of democracy movement in Hong Kong, which I think is quite amazing, actually. And I'm supporting you all to have such a great passion for democracy here. Thank you. Okay. Good. So why actually compare? Why not just look at yourself and then do what you can do? So, I mean, basically, we do that all the time in our lives, right? When you go out and look at the food, you compare the food with each other and say, this one's more tasty than that one, so I'll choose that better one, So comparing is something we do every day, all the time. You also compare different girls, maybe, if you're a boy, So basically, you always compare, So why we do it in a scientific context is we want to gain knowledge. We want to learn more. And if we learn more, we also know perhaps what we need to look out for or what we need to be prepared for. So I think Singapore provides some lessons what one needs to avoid in order to keep Hong Kong's democracy movement strong. Instead of maybe other movements that you've heard in other lectures where we look for a positive example, Singapore is more like a negative example. Also, comparativists use classify and generalize. So we can classify, for instance, the political system of Hong Kong. I will do this later, and then make some lessons from that. We can formulate test theories. This may be less relevant in this instance, but it's important to know. And we can consider whether our interpretation of events is actually valid, whether that's the real truth or just our subjective interpretation. And finally, and I think that's one point I want to make, is maybe we can try to have some prediction about the future, and hope that if we know what the future could hold, we might be able to change it, because the future is still in our hands. So that's why we compare. Now, what are important similarities? Why can we compare Singapore and to Hong Kong? Size. The most important thing, Singapore is small, Hong Kong is small. So basically, that gives you many people here know each other, especially among the democracy movement. All the activists know each other very well. That similar aspect about population and population density. Both places are very densely populated. Meaning we are close together, and therefore it's very similar. Highly urbanized. Look at the skyline here. Singapore has an equally impressive skyline. So this kind of urbanization, I think, is important because there's no countryside or very little countryside. When you have a country like Thailand, you have a very poor countryside and very rich city. Then there's lots of conflict. But in Hong Kong, there is no conflict between any countryside. And same thing applies to Singapore. So that makes it comparable. An important thing, the majority is ethnic Chinese. So the cultural similarity is very strong. I think in some instances also now this relationship with mainland China is very similar. The Singaporeans are also afraid of invading mainlanders, yeah, or they call them PRC, yeah. So there is a similarity in that sense too. And then, of course, institutionally, both are former British colonies, yeah. So government institutions, especially bureaucracy, are run in a very similar fashion. That means they have the basic ideas of democracy ingrained in them. Yeah, there is a legal system which is supposed to work independently and neutrally. Yeah. This is very important cornerstone of democracy, and this is, at least in principle, available in both Singapore and Hong Kong. Yeah. And yeah, I mentioned this, the legal system is crucial. Yeah. And I think Hong Kong's legal system needs to be defended first and foremost. Okay. Economically, of course, the other thing, Hong Kong and Singapore always fighting against each other. Yeah? Who is better, who is better? Yeah? So economically, both have competed over the time extensively, and both have rapid economic growth. I mean, you can also see this in these buildings. Yeah? Rich, very rich, high GDP per capita. Even if and there's also high human development according to the development index. However, at the same time, we have high income inequality. Yeah? People, there are a few rich, yeah, and many, many poor people in Hong Kong. And the same thing is in Singapore. When you look at the most unequally society in the world, actually that's Hong Kong, yeah, in terms of developed economies. Here, and second is Singapore among developed economies. Yeah? And then comes the US. That's in comparison to all the European countries, which are much more equal, yeah? Where the rich do not earn as much more than the poor people. Yeah? And I think that's one reason in terms of democracy movement, yeah? Why the business people who recently went to Beijing, yeah? They're so afraid of democracy because it is a social. They are afraid of the many poor people. They're demanding more right to say in Hong Kong. Yeah. So clearly, high income inequality matters, and we might understand why actually in both places, and there is very little democracy movement in Singapore, despite that fact. And also we have, another problem is long working hours, of course, yeah, in both places. This has an important aspect, because if you work long hours, what can you not do, right? You cannot participate in a protest, yeah? And you cannot care much about democracy. You have to concern about your money first, yeah? And that's why students now at the forefront here, because if you don't want to lose your job, you better come to work and spend those many hours, yeah? And then your salary is not that high, yeah? So you can't risk basically doing that. And also, and I find that is troublesome, and in both places, yeah, troublesome for democracy movement is there's a strong desire to emigrate. Yeah? A lot of people would like to leave to another place. But if you really want to defend your own place, your own country, or your own city, yeah, you need to stay and fight. Yeah? Because then, but there is a strong desire among, in Singapore especially, yeah, people want to rather leave than stay, despite the good, so-called good economic conditions. Okay, so these are the main similarities. Let's point out some differences, which are also quite important. Yeah? The most important one is Singapore is an independent country. Yeah? And Hong Kong has become a part of China in 1997. And when we look at it, that makes a huge difference. Yeah? But our expectation would be, yeah, Singapore is its own country, so that people can would be more ready to fight for democracy, right? They have a better chance of achieving the goal because they don't have a government in Beijing that's so big and huge and that tries to control Hong Kong, which you cannot defeat as a small city, Hong Kong, yeah? So in terms of independence, Singapore has actually better cards, but still the people are less willing to fight for democracy. So this does not explain to me why Hong Kong democracy movement is stronger than the one in Singapore. So my argument here, my key argument is that this difference rests with the political regime. Yeah? The political regime is very important. So what is the political regime? Anyone know what is the political system in Hong Kong? Anyone know? It's been called, and I cite from the literature, yeah, but I don't have the source now, liberal authoritarianism. Yeah, it is actually a rare thing. It's hard to come up with any other place in the world which has a system that's liberal and authoritarian at the same time. So Hong Kong is unique in that sense. So you don't have full elections for legislative council and chief executive. And even if they change this with this cute election plan, there is still no democracy in Hong Kong. As you would say that in North Korea, they also do not have any elections, even though they have no democracy, even though everyone can vote for the dear leader, right? So either who's in favor of the dear leader, and anyone who says no gets killed, yeah? So that's even worse, yeah? But if you have two people who look the same, yeah, and you can choose between both of them, it's so hard to choose, yeah? So you probably will stay away from choosing, yeah? It's quite understandable. So there will not be, China also does not want to change Hong Kong's political system away from that liberal authoritarianism. So in Singapore, it's very different. Singapore is officially already a democracy. It's all people are required to vote. There's mandatory voting in Singapore. Yeah, and however, the elections are not fair. They are free. Everyone has and can vote, but they have lots of unfairness. Yeah, and these unfairness make it so hard for any opposition party to actually compete on a level playing field. You can imagine, it's like a soccer field that's like this, yeah? The ball will always roll down into the one goal instead of the, yeah? So it's very unfair. This is the threat that they can institute in Hong Kong, or that they would like to have a system that is as skewed as the one in Singapore, where opposition parties or contenders are unable to compete, and the elites, the business interests, would be able to always dominate. Yeah? This is called electoral authoritarianism. Yeah? Clearly not a democracy, electoral authoritarianism. And I mean, there are also strict limits. I mean, what are the restrictions in Singapore? I just mentioned a few. Like freedom of the press. We only have state-owned press in Singapore. And they will always report, or mostly report, what the government wants to hear. And they will not allow much alternative opinion. This has recently changed with the internet, but the government still tries to crack down on internet opinion. So it's very difficult to there wouldn't be an Apple Daily, for instance, in Singapore. This is impossible. Yeah. Other things are multi-member districts, which make it so difficult for opposition parties to run for office, or just 9 days of election campaign, which means a very short campaign. And if you are unknown as an opposition candidate, how can you fairly compete with the government? Yeah? And then restrictions on how you can get money, and so on and so on. I can mention more. So the key difference is extent of civil liberties. Hong Kong has a lot of civil liberties still, yeah, and Singapore has very few. And that is crucial for understanding the difference in democracy movement between the two places. So, yeah, difference is, of course, democracy movement in Hong Kong is much stronger. And they can mobilize many people. I mean, I go every year to July 1st protest, and it's always amazing. Yeah, you see so many people come to the street, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, depending on the year. Yeah, despite rain and extreme heat. Yeah, and the same conditions apply in Singapore. So you have people willing to come out. And that's not the case in Singapore. If you want to organize a protest, and there is now the possibility of doing that, few people will actually show up. Yeah. So protests have become much more frequent and much more intense here in recent times. This year was especially high at July 1st, but also June 4th. I saw many people, unfortunately wasn't there this year, but it's very nice to see people joining for the candlelight. And also the alternative protest, I should mention. Yeah? So there's actually so much activism now. And we can see this now in the student boycott and so on. Yeah? I think it'll be much more in the coming weeks. In Singapore, the protests are in a small park called Hong Lim Park. It's near Chinatown, not in a central part. If you protest in any other place or even try to march anywhere, they will arrest you even before you started marching. And they will say, even though you never marched, you had the intention of marching, therefore you can get arrested for it. Yeah? That actually happened in Hong Kong too in the 1970s. Yeah? So it's not that foreign to this place here. Yeah? In the 1970s, we had the same thing here. However, many people in Singapore, despite there's now protests, they stay away because they say, we have elections, so we want to kick out the ruling party at the next election, despite the fact that the elections are totally unfair and the chances are very, very low. Yeah, so it's a very smart way of controlling the democracy movement. Also difference, that's the same thing, is the Democrats in Singapore are rarely willing to take any risks. Yeah? I mean, we saw some activists take a risk, challenge the regime, but they were branded as activists. And if you look at the slide, that was before a couple, maybe 2006, I don't remember actually, but there were very few, only a hand, even 4 or 5 activists, and the police was surrounding them with heavy armor and so on. People still consider them to be extremists today, yeah? And that's because the media made them into extremists. Say, look at these people, they are crazy, they go out on the street and protest despite being illegal. So the people, because they have very few alternative sources of information, they tend to believe in them extremists, yeah? And one of the leader is Dr. Chi Soon-juan. And I'd like to mention this at this point. We are happy to have him, Dr. Chi, come to City University of Hong Kong, where I teach, yeah, in November. So if you're interested in learning more about it, and directly from a major Singapore activist, democracy activist, yeah, please come to and check the Southeast Asia Research Center website for the update, which should be next week, end of next week perhaps, or the week after, we will be able to post the information. But that is a very leading figure, and he should be able to tell more about this part. But I think it's quite fascinating to have him here in November. So similarities, however, and we should note that there are similarities. The key one is both of the democracy movements are very fragmented. In Singapore, as in Hong Kong. Yeah? In Hong Kong, the democracy movement is divided between civil society activists and political society, the parties, yeah, especially the more moderate party like Democratic Party or more radical parties in Hong Kong. So there are very much divisions over strategies, goals, and so on. So it's some scholars argue that it's a serious problem. Yeah, and then also, I mean, even I think among you, some of you might support Occupy Central to go out there and boycott the streets, while maybe the majority of Hong Kongers are still afraid to break the law, yeah, and do not want to end in jail, yeah. So divisions over whether civil disobedience is justified or not exist as well. So there is much fragmentation, and let me those fragmentation actually were created by the government in Hong Kong. Yeah? When in 1997 the reforms were introduced, a new electoral system was created, which is very complex, and I'm not able to tell you here in a short time. So I'm only telling you that this involved proportional representation, which created many small parties, and especially weakened the more moderate and very strong Democratic Party, which had the majority support in Hong Kong before the handover. And this introduction of this new electoral system created many splits within the Democratic Party. And it's I would call it divide and conquer strategy. It's an attempt to weaken the democracy movement in Hong Kong. It hasn't worked fully, but it has worked to some extent. Yeah. When the legislative council reforms were in 2010, and the Democratic Party decided to cooperate with Beijing in that reform proposal for the one functional constituency, that created deep rift within the movement. So that is a serious problem. And in Singapore, we have, in comparison, we have a very divided opposition movement. The strongest one is the Workers' Party, and the Workers' Party has a large support among the population. And they are also very, very moderate. That's different from Hong Kong, where the radicals were growing in power, while in Singapore, the more moderate Workers' Party has increased in strength. But it is unwilling to cooperate with other parties because it does not need to. If you're the strongest party, why would you cooperate with others? Yeah? So Workers' Party remained by itself. And other parties, which were framed by the regime as radical, are also divided among each other due to many reasons, including personality conflicts and, of course, ideology and policies. Yeah? And because the government has created institutions that weakened opposition, the goal had also been to divide and conquer the parties. And there is one thing that's called gerrymandering. It's famous in the US, yeah, for creating districts to favor your party. And in Singapore, every time you have an election, the districts are drawn again, yeah, and that makes it very hard for opposition parties to compete. And also it divides up the support of opposition parties, and you can send, and because the government can fairly well estimate the support, so they can weaken the opposition by doing so. So it's heavily divided, and also there is a great divide between political and civil society in Singapore, because the civil society feels that if they support democracy too much, maybe the government will crack down on them, and then they cannot do anything anymore. So basically, civil society in Singapore keeps a strong distance from political society. And when you look at the protests, I mean, except for the Singapore Democratic Party, which is considered the radicals, and is headed by Dr. Chee Soon-juan, who I mentioned earlier, yeah, they might show up as a protest, but the Workers' Party especially will never show up at a protest, yeah, and many of the civil society groups will also not come. Only a few, like daring young activists who are willing to challenge the regime, yeah. So in keeping with the time, yeah, and hoping to give you more time to ask questions. Yeah, I'm at the end. I have some conclusions. I think divisions that I mentioned, those divisions are very normal. I mean, when you have a democracy movement, you will have divisions because people disagree over many things. People are not... we are not animals walking in one line like sheep, yeah? We are humans, so we have disagreements over issues. So that's normal. We wouldn't expect a democracy movement to be reunited. And in this way, I disagree with some of the literature that says we can have a united democracy movement because people are divided. But what I can see is that the regime is constantly using this fact to divide and conquer, yeah, to divide the opposition and form different groups. So the introduction of electoral system in 1997 in Hong Kong was intentionally set there to divide the Hong Kong democracy movement. And this is a serious problem. Yeah. The second thing I think is what the Singapore example shows us is that media, having a plural media, having freedom of speech is essential, yeah, for a democracy. So the attempts recently of undermining Hong Kong's freedom of the press is clearly a challenge and a problem for the future Hong Kong democracy movement. Yeah? And Also, I mean, the second assembly laws, yeah, all these things, once the freedoms are taken away, how can one fight anymore for democracy? And most people are very pragmatic. They don't want to break the law. Yeah? Even if the law is unjust and unfair, people still will not break the law. This is clear in Singapore's case when Dr. Chee Soon-juan and the Democratic Party started their civil disobedience campaign. No one actually joined them, yeah? And if you're only the one who joins, yeah, you end up in jail or bankrupt, as Dr. Chee ended up, yeah, and was unable to do anything, yeah? So clearly, you need a big group of people, large support. And the media, I mean, the internet can do something, but most people still read the mainstream media, the newspapers, and the television. So as long as there's still media freedom in Hong Kong, I think there is no problem, but it is in decline right now. So I think this is a major challenge and a long-term problem for Hong Kong's democracy movement. And with these words, I'd like to conclude this and open the floor for any questions on Singapore, because I have very limited time, but I would like to give you a lot of opportunity to ask questions. Thank you very much.
You
can ask in Cantonese and they can translate for you.
嗰度，嗰度，望唔望到？想問問題嘅同學可唔可以舉一次手啊？係。轉頭呢邊好唔好？我哋俾嗰邊問咗先。
Do you think that the people's awareness that they are living in the same city and sharing the belongingness to the city is important for striving for democracy, since this kind of ideology is not very widely accepted in Hong Kong, and I'm pretty curious about how Singaporeans think about their city as well.
Why? Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think that sense of belonging is extremely important. If you look at the democracy literature, the key element is to have a united nation and a national identity as the basis for democratization. Yeah, and since this, I mean, in Hong Kong, it's only a emerging identity, and even in Singapore, people are not very strong in their identification. I mentioned earlier, a lot of people would like to leave and live in another place, and that shows you that these people are actually not very strongly attached to their own home place, but are willing to, if they have a chance, if they have enough money, yeah, or have a job, go to Australia, US, Canada. These are favorite places of emigration, yeah. And I think actually the identity in Hong Kong is stronger, yeah, than in Singapore among the people here. And that's from my experience with my students in my classroom. I always have I'm teaching social research methods, and I have an interview on identity, and that gives the students the chance to show their strength and their belief in Hong Kong. Yeah, so that's much stronger, I think, than among many Singaporeans. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah. Anyone?
Yeah, thank you. Okay. I want to ask how to keep our faith in the democracy movement. For example, you mentioned about in Singapore, the freedom of speech or freedom of the press is also very limited. And we know that nowadays, Hong Kong, these kind of freedom are also decreasing at the limit. So how can we keep our faith and try to strive for what we want to?
Yeah, that's a big challenge, yeah? A very big challenge. I think, of course, you need to keep the spirit alive by publishing about it, writing about it, trying to get it wherever it is possible, into the mainstream media, into the newspapers, in any form you can. Let the other people understand what it actually means, what the freedom of speech, why it is so important that you're able to speak out. Yeah, and this means a lot. If you even from business people, actually, it is. if they want workers only, yeah, then it's good to be compliant and not do anything. But if you're a business person, you need to make decisions, yeah. You need to be able to think critically, be able to evaluate things. So it is very important for them as well. So also it's important to communicate to the business leaders that freedom of speech is essential for businesses, yeah. And if you want to be competitive in the world in the future, yeah, and not just rely on trade and the outside world. And in Singapore, by the way, you use foreigners. They always import foreigners to get their critical and critically thinking people in. I don't think that's a sustainable strategy either. Yeah, you need to make them sure that this is in the interest of everyone. Yeah, and especially in a modern, complicated business environment and society, which is as complex as Hong Kong. Yeah, so I think that's the only way you can do it. Tell them as much as you can. Any other question?
Hello. I want to ask about, there are many comparisons between Hong Kong and Singapore recently about English proficiency or their competence internationally. I want to ask, in your opinion, is there any clear linkage or relation between between Hong Kong and Singapore with respect to their international status by democracy?
Okay, that was 2 points, I think. One is the language proficiency, and clearly Singaporeans are more proficient in English. Yeah, their native language is basically English for most people. Yeah, or many people. The young people, they are educated in. They start very young with English, or so English is more important there. And if you go to campus, you will not even hear people speak that much in other languages. They will mostly speak with each other in English, yeah, and all the classroom, and then the other activities are in English. That being said, I think in terms of, in that sense, the Western literature has an impact nowadays on Singapore in getting in more easily the democracy ideas into Singapore. However, it doesn't mean that, we can see that Singapore is not democratic. And so English itself does not help making people democratic. Yeah, it can go either way. And if you see Britain, actually also the basic idea in Britain is it's a electoral authoritarian regime in potential, and only because Britain has these democratic values that it works as a democracy. But if Britain became more and more authoritarian in terms of values, it could also slip. Yeah, it's a serious challenge there too. It needs to be ingrained in a constitution, and Singapore's constitution is not democratic enough. Yeah, it has a lot of exceptions. Yeah, that make it problematic and need to be reformed. Yeah, but it's not in the interest of the regime. And democracy movement, though, is growing in Singapore, and many Singaporeans say, oh, we want to let in more Hong Kongers so they can teach us democratization. Yeah, so there is some, especially among those activists. Yeah, I'm not talking about the establishment in Singapore, of course. Yeah, but the activists, they look at Singapore. They post. I have many Singaporean friends on Facebook. They always post pictures from protests here or so, and say, wow, those Hong Kongers, they really dare something. We should learn from them. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you have. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Hong Kong is a very special place, and then it's different from China. We have our own language, and we have our legal system. We have different core values, and I want to ask: do you think we can be independent like Singapore?
Now in a world, I understand this question, and from feeling I can feel it's very independent here, yeah. But in a world without, reality, yeah, without the fact that China is so huge and powerful and has a large army and lots of strength, yeah, and especially money, yeah, a lot of money nowadays, yeah. I don't think it's possible. Theoretically, it would be. as Singapore is possible too, if you have an arrangement with the mainland. Yeah? In Singapore, it's independent because it was actually kicked out of the mainland. Yeah? They were forced independent because the People's Action Party, the ruling party in Singapore, did something the Malaysians didn't like. That means get involved in politics. Yeah? And they said, okay, you Chinese island, get out of Malaysia and form your independent state. But I think the leadership in Singapore is still open toward future reunification with Malaysia. Yeah? This idea is sometimes played in the media. What would be if Singapore become again united with Malaysia or something like that, because they think it's not viable. They think pragmatically. Yeah? But I think it is, of course, possible. I mean, Hong Kong is larger than many European countries which are independent. Yeah? I mean, not just Liechtenstein or something like that, which is just a village with 20,000 people, yeah, or small town, yeah. I think it's not even 20,000, yeah. But then Luxembourg is independent, yeah. It's very rich and also does not have so many million people as Hong Kong. So theoretically it's possible, but China does not allow it. So realistically, it's not possible. Unfortunately, yeah.
Hi, Professor. I would like to know whether the Singapore have the political party which is considered to be extreme, such as the People Power in Hong Kong, and if yes, how do they influence the society and the constituency? Okay. Thank you.
This question is interesting because the problem is the extreme is defined differently. Now in Hong Kong, People Power might go around throwing bananas or stuff like that. Yeah. In Singapore, even having a protest, at least at that time, yeah, was considered extreme. Yeah? So even if you just do something against the regime, might be extreme. Yeah? Nowadays, I unfortunately to say that the extreme, the parties in Singapore have now all decided that they want to moderate themselves to become more popular to the elections. Yeah? And so even the Singapore Democratic Party, which is largely seen as the most extreme, yeah, has moved more to the moderate center and just provided alternative policies and so on, yeah, and is trying to compete in elections. Maybe they show up at a protest, yeah, which is now legal in this small park, yeah, but it's not the same kind of extreme. If you meet with, I mean, when I started doing research on Singapore and everyone said this is extremist, yeah, I went and met Dr. Chi personally, and he was with his little kid. He was talking very calmly and friendly, and there was nothing extreme about him, yeah. It's just the media painted him so extreme, yeah. And they wouldn't dare doing anything like the People Power Party does, yeah. And it wouldn't be popular either, yeah. Okay.
Hi, Professor. And
Yes.
it seems, I don't know really much about Singapore, but their ethnicity is Chinese and their official language and native language is English, supposedly. Like most of them.
Okay, so the native language is English plus so-called mother tongue. Yeah. So if you are Chinese ethnicity 100%, yeah, then you have to learn Mandarin in school, yeah, because it's the Chinese language of the Chinese government, yeah, and they think that is for the, even though most of the groups of people who emigrated to Singapore are not native Mandarin speakers, yeah, and if you are an Indian, because there's a large Indian group, then you have to learn Tamil, and if you're Malay, yeah, you have to learn Malay in school. And if you are neither of them, that's the fourth group, you don't have to learn any language, yeah, and you might even be 95% Chinese, yeah, if you can escape it, yeah.
Well, I know some friends from Singapore, their ethnicity is Chinese, but they barely know any Chinese. And is that, and from what you say, it seems the trend in Singapore that English is the main language.
Yes.
And them stripped from their mother language and like mother culture, like their history, is that an important part in the sense of home and
I think so. Yeah, it's moving toward a. I mean, Singlish. Singlish is their official. Is an attempt to create a national language for Singapore. It combines English and a little bit of Chinese grammar and some Malay words and Indian words, and it's English still. You can understand it after practice. Yeah, but it's a yeah. I forgot the linguistic term for it, but it's their own. Yeah, that's an attempt to create an identity. I'm saying, but the government likes to discourage that. Yeah, and they have a Speak Good English campaign. Yeah, and a Speak Mandarin campaign and so on. Yeah, so make people not, because they think speaking good English and speaking good Chinese would be best for business interests. Yeah.
It seems it's happening in Hong Kong as well, as Cantonese is being degraded by the government. And we'd like to know your view on like degrading the mother tongue in democracy.
I think I'm not sure about democracy, but I think in Hong Kong the attempt to create Mandarin has two reasons. First of all, of course, greater control by the Chinese government over Hong Kong, yeah, clearly. And the second one is business interests. Because if you want to compete with the rest companies in China, yeah, you need better Mandarin skills or Putonghua skills, yeah. So it's a win-win for that business government elite group, yeah. But it loses there's some loss of identity for Hong Kongers as a group itself, yeah. And it might have a negative impact on democracy, yes.
Hi, Professor. As you mentioned, Singapore is an electoral authoritarian regime, and would you think that that kind of election actually stabilize the authorities' power or so-called legitimize the power, and another way one that move towards the progress of the democratizations in the experience of Singapore, and applying the same situation in Hong Kong. So you think that even though we have universal suffrage, actually in Hong Kong now, the pro-Beijing parties, they actually start getting more votes in the elections, in the legislative council's elections, and even district council's elections. So even though we got universal suffrage, it actually seems to be a way to legitimize their power or stabilize their power. Yes, thank you.
Yes. Let me start with the last question. Yes, that's the attempt. Yeah, the attempt is to stabilize and legitimize the regime. In Singapore, indeed. I mean, the question is, does these elections stabilize or not? I was just at a workshop last week, yeah, discussing this very question. We are not really 100% sure, because the elections at least give Democrats a chance to speak out once in a while. But, of course, I mentioned earlier, people will not go into a protest because they can vote. Yeah? So they say, why go and protest if I can vote? I can show them how through the electoral ballot box. Yeah? So it strengthens the regime, and it has legitimized Singapore's regime for a long time. Yeah? And therefore, it is a danger for Hong Kong as well. It might change in the future if, for instance, they realize that these elections are useless and they really want to have a change. And then I think over time, it still can be undermined, but it takes a very long time. Yeah? And in the attempt in Hong Kong, to return to the second part, I think it's not very successful because of the divisions in society in Hong Kong. Yeah? I mean, there is still a very strong pan-democratic sentiment here, and this has undermined the attempt to create a unified legitimacy, yeah, by the pro-government elites. And that's why they actually want to move to this new system of universal suffrage with some pre-selection mode. That's why I would definitely veto the proposal by the central government. Yeah, I think there's no other way. No Democratic Party should actually support this proposal. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your lecture. I just realized that my question is a little bit not related to Singapore, but recently, as you may be aware, that the government is trying to propose, or the pro-Beijing camp has tried to propose a new amending the selections for the Legislative Council members, trying to increase the number of geographical constituencies from 5 to 9, narrowing the size of each constituency, of course, and then they are trying to kind of like minimizing the chances of some small parties to win the elections. It is more like Singapore that they are trying to make the big parties to win. Okay, even though it's not like Singapore, as a Singapore, it's a very special election system, but how's your take on that?
I think in Hong Kong, the attempt is, of course, to strengthen the DAB, the Democratic Alliance for Betterment of Hong Kong, by allowing them to get the money to the people and I won't say buy votes, but get the support of the voters and that is a very similar tactic that the Singapore People's Action Party has used. Yeah? So in a way, I'm not sure how this new proposal wants to accomplish this, but I think in some way, if they introduce reforms, that this should be one part in their attempt to create that. But I don't think they want a united, only let big parties win, because they don't want to have a united opposition in the form of a Democratic Party, for instance. They want lots of small parties, and then the DAB is the largest party nowadays. So that's in their favor, because then they can say, look at those radicals. They only want to trouble. They are troublemakers, and we don't want them to have any say. So please be responsible, Hong Kongers, and listen to the DAB. I think this is the attempt. That's why they strengthen more radical parties, instead of having a united, larger Democratic Party. More questions?
First of all, thank you for your insightful comparisons. My question is, how important do you think national sovereignty is to one's region's democratization movements? Thank you.
Okay, I think it's very important in some ways, because first of all, for Hong Kong, because of the lack of sovereignty, this whole thing actually exists now. The Chinese government getting greater influence over Hong Kong without having your own say, without having your own country. Actually, all of China needs to be reformed, need to have democratization. Because if only Hong Kong has it, it is, in my opinion, even threatening to the central government, because somehow someone is actually elected by the people, while the central government is not even elected by the people. So it is basically inside a country is more difficult than sovereignty. So Singapore actually has a much better, that's why I mentioned it, much better basis for democratization than Hong Kong, but their identity or the government has never stressed the Singaporeanness that much, and more pragmatic ideas of being a global center of city. And then many Singaporeans see their job and their pragmatic business career as more important than defending and protecting Singapore. Though that's changing now, and I think the more the economic situation in Singapore gets difficult, the more likely I think Singaporeans will push for greater democratization. And because they have their own country, they can actually achieve it without anyone getting involved, which Hong Kong can unfortunately not do. Okay, more questions? Well, we have a microphone.
Hello. So for the election system that has been proposed for 2017, which is not fully democratic, the Beijing government has defined it as being universal suffrage and fully democratic. So if this system is accepted for Hong Kong, would it be possible to still have political reform after 2017? Because according to the definition of the Central Party, the Beijing government, then Hong Kong has already gotten universal suffrage in 2017.
Yeah, that is a very good question, and probably no. Yeah, this is my first answer. The Singapore case actually shows that that is an attempt to depoliticize or to take out the steam out of the democracy movement. Yeah, I mean, what will happen if we accept this proposal by the Chinese government, and then we have two candidates who are almost the same? Who will go and vote? Yeah, I think no one here. Yeah, and very few people, and they will all not go and vote, and then they say, Hong Kongers are not interested in voting. There's no interest in democracy. Okay, so we just keep this system, yeah? And we now have someone who's elected by universal suffrage. So we've fulfilled our promise, yeah, to the Hong Kong people and to the basic law. And I think it is a bad choice to do this because it's an attempt to create a veneer of legitimacy, but no real political change. And the government, of course, will claim that it's democratic, and so that's an attempt to put a very beautiful spin on something that's actually not democratic. Yeah, it's actually, if you have no choice, if someone tell you, you have a choice for dinner tonight, yeah, and they say, but it's noodle or noodle, yeah, and it's only a different type of noodle, yeah, then you will say, oh, I wanted to eat rice. So it's not a choice, yeah. It's not democracy. Yes.
So what if the proposal is vetoed? If it's vetoed?
Vetoed. It most likely will be vetoed. Yeah?
So what will happen then?
The problem is that Beijing has very good cards. Yeah? They will just say, yeah, the Hong Kongers had their chance of getting universal suffrage, and they rejected it. Yeah, and so we can't help them either. Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like a win-win situation for Beijing. Yeah, and so either way you go, it will not be very. But I think it's better than having fake elections than having no elections.
If you still have a question, maybe you can discuss with Stephen after the seminar. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.